Good morning. Welcome to the Point. This morning, as the Thanksgiving holiday wraps up, we talk with an attorney who represents a number of former lawmakers who say they shouldn't be barred from running for office just because they have experience. In other words, the 8 former members of the state House and state Senate want to do away with term limits and have filed a federal lawsuit to do just that. The attorney that represents them is John Bursch. Let's start with the very basics. A lawsuit that would greatly impact term limits in the state of Michigan. Tell me how this came about and tell me what you hope to do.
This has been a multi-year conversation between key players in the Republican and Democrat movements. And what everybody agrees on is that something is seriously wrong with the political system in Lansing. And that comes about from the term limits, which have been in our Constitution now since the early 1990s, that limit state representatives to 6 years and state senators to 8 years, and then they're banned for life. And so just when someone is starting to get their feet under them, understanding how the institution works, they're getting the experience, they're out. And as a result of that, the legislature doesn't function as well as it should. And power ends up being shifted to the permanent bureaucracy and to lobbyists. And so the hope, and again, this is bipartisan, is to knock out the current system, maybe even put a new one in place, but something that would give the legislators more time so they can get to know each other, get to know the agencies that they're regulating, and be better governors.
So you are going to ask the federal courts to intervene in what was a public vote of the people of the state of Michigan, now decades old.
Yes.
And will you be asking just to do away with that? You suggested that maybe there would be some type of a replacement, but that wouldn't be up to the courts, would it?
Correct. The courts couldn't just enforce or enact a replacement. But there's been some proposals coming out of the legislature lately to do some different things. But in order to get those passed, you would actually have to go to the ballot and amend the Constitution again. And that's a very difficult and expensive process. In the past, when we enacted term limits, it involved tens of millions of dollars in out-of-state money coming in so that non-Michiganders could enact their view of what our term limits should look like. And so we think it would be very difficult. Our vision is to wipe away what we have right now and then start a conversation. And if people think that there's a system that should be in place that does put some limits on legislators, but not as draconian as Michigan's, which are worst in the nation, both in the short term and the lifetime ban. But let's have that conversation and maybe we can find something. Other states have 12 years, sit off a term, come back again, or 12 years in one chamber, move to the other chamber, then you can come back. There's all kinds of ways that you can do it. But what has become crystal clear is that our legislature is just having difficulty by constantly kicking out the people who have experience in the system that we have.
This has been going on for a while. Some will say, why now?
Well, I think it's kind of come to a critical mass and critical attention of people because of the disputes that we've had over road funding over the last couple of years. Why can't we get that done? And there's a lot of reasons for that, and this isn't casting blame on anyone. But the folks who are in power at one point and think they might be working on a solution, all of a sudden within an election cycle or two are gone again. And when you don't have the long-term relationships, you don't have the long-term institutional knowledge of how the Department of Transportation budget works and all those sorts of things, it makes solving Michigan's biggest problems difficult.
When you talk about the people that are involved, we're looking largely at the legislative term limits. There are term limits for constitutional offices too. Does your lawsuit deal with those?
It only deals with the state legislators, although if the court would rule in favor on our constitutional theory, it could also have a trickle-down effect to local term limits. So for example, in Grand Rapids, the city council term limits that were recently enacted are very similar to what we have in the legislature. And so presumably those could be affected too. But this will not affect the terms for governor, attorney general, Secretary of State, and so on.
When you talk about bringing Republicans and Democrats together for a common event like this, who are we talking about? Who are the former legislators?
We have 8 former legislators. Their names are all in the press release. And it's a mix of Republicans and Democrats from urban and rural areas, just across the spectrum in their political beliefs, but also their individual diversity. And each one of them makes the case that they can see a diminution in the way that the legislature has functioned as a result of losing all this experience. You can vote for a legislative candidate for any ground or factor that you would like except for one, and that is their experience. That's the one thing that's been taken off the table. And many of them would run again if they had the opportunity to do that. Others who wouldn't would vote for somebody who might be term limited because they think that that experience is so valuable. So in this day and age, as you know, it's really unusual to have Democrats and Republicans working together. That tells you how serious they believe the problem is in Lansing, that they would come together in an effort like this.
Term limits were put in place for a lot of different reasons. There were a lot of people that were interested in creating the term limits, and I won't assign what their motivation was, but one of the publicly stated was if you leave people in office too long, they end up being too connected.
Yes.
Sometimes even corrupt, people would say, and term limits kept one person from being in charge of the Judiciary Committee for 20 years or being in charge of appropriations for 20 years. So to those people, and obviously you're not arguing this as a matter of a ballot initiative, so it's not about convincing them, but what would you say to people who say, well, wait a minute, we voted on this. This is what we wanted, so why should the courts overturn it?
I would say three things. First, just because we're getting rid of the shortest, most restrictive term limits in the nation doesn't mean that there can't be a replacement that would prevent the 30-year person on the Judiciary Committee, but something more reasonable that gives them a chance. One of the things I like about the serve for a bit, sit out, and then come back is it takes away some of that incumbents advantage that they talk about. The second thing I would say is that because of the internet and other ways of social media of accessing voters, it's not as easy to stay in office today as it was years ago. We could see this with recent congressional races where heavily favored Republicans and Democrats have lost to grassroots candidates because there's a way to communicate that simply didn't exist in a broad way in the early 1990s. The third thing that I would say is that when we instituted the term limits, one of the main drivers, in addition to those folks who were there a really, really long time, was to make a better Michigan government. And I'm not sure, and I couldn't tell you what the right number is, what the right system is that will get us to the magic place where Michigan government is better. But this broad coalition, the spectrum of Democrats and Republicans agree that what we have in place now did not accomplish that goal. And so it's time to wipe that slate clean and try something else.
When you think about the problems in government, do you believe that term limits is very high up on the list with problems? Because there are any number of shortcomings that I can see when I'm in Lansing, and some may well be fueled by term limits, but do you think that this is really a big driver of whatever ails the system?
I do think it's a big driver. I think there are other drivers too. But the thing with the other drivers, whether it be legislators who are then immediately going into lobbying practices or lame duck legislation or any of the other things that people point to as being potential problems, you can deal with all of those by a simple enactment. All the legislature has to do is sit down with the governor, figure out how to solve that problem, enact it into law, and then you're done. The problem that's unique to term limits is that because it's ensconced in the Constitution, we need to have a court ruling to wipe the slate clean before we can put in a better system. The only other alternative to that, as I mentioned, is to have some initiative that goes to the voters. And it's really, really difficult to get them to amend the Constitution. It's going to cost tens of millions of dollars. And while there are lots of non-Michigan special interests that would be more than happy to pour that money in to make sure that such an initiative is defeated, I don't know that you could find tens of millions of dollars being paid by people who support good government who could fight against that. But this will give everybody an opportunity to have a voice and then put the matter back to the legislature and the governor to enact a better system.
And there's the other question of what the people of Michigan really want despite the money, because if you ask most people, they still like the idea of term limits, at least in a very unscientific poll, because I hear it all the time. People are talking about, we hear a lot about throw the bums out.
Yes.
And in Michigan, that's essentially what happens is that every 3 terms over in the House, a lawmaker is replaced. And I would be interested to see any polling on that from the state. But do you think that by doing this, that you bring to the attention of people who haven't maybe thought about term limits what you believe they are doing to government? Or is this really kind of going against the will of the people.
No, I think that there's a strong educational component to this lawsuit. I think if you do ask the average person, what do you think about term limits, they support them. And it's really difficult to say to them, well, why not give more time to the people that you hate? That's why people like term limits. But when they stop and think about, well, how about Representative so-and-so or Senator so-and-so, who was really terrific, and I really loved it when they were my representative. Boy, it would be nice to have them in Lansing again, because they were someone who was willing to engage in conversation, to think outside the box, to really be creative in solving Michigan's problems. I wish I could have them back. And in addition, you've got the input that many people won't have from those who are actually in Lansing, rolling up their sleeves and trying to do all the work, like the 8 plaintiffs in this case. I think that there's a strong body of knowledge in Lansing about the problems that term limits causes to an effective government, to good Michigan government. But we need to get that message out to more people. And I think this lawsuit and some of the publicity around it will do that.
When we come back, Representative Bradley Slagh from Ottawa County talks about some of the work that legislators do that you may not even think about. That's next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. We often talk about some of the big, broad brushstroke things that happen in Lansing, budgets, auto no-fault insurance, the big stuff. But lawmakers spend a fair amount of their time working on equally important, though perhaps more localized and less publicized matters that impact their constituency. We talk about some of those with Ottawa County Representative Bradley Slagh. Representative, one of the things that I think people don't understand about some of what happens in Lansing is that when things are decided upon, there can be unintended consequences. And in the conversation that you and I were having about speed limits, some changes made a while back that allow for some higher speed limits on some rural 4-lane highways may have inadvertently changed things around a little bit for the way speed limits might be set in your hometown, for example.
Exactly.
So tell me about the legislative action that you took and what you were trying to achieve.
Okay, so we did get some feedback about the law that was passed in 2016, change the speed limits. One of the things that didn't work very well is that in a city, in a residential zone, you're required to not only post speed limits, but if it's in a neighborhood, a residential neighborhood, you would have to do a speed study first, and then you'd have to post the speed limits. And every time there's a change in type of road surface, or whether it narrows or widens or anything, you'd have to repost it at each of those intervals. For the city of Holland, which is in my district, obviously, they believe that there's a $200,000 bill just for those speed studies and then for posting all of those different signs. And then obviously there's a ongoing maintenance cost to those speed limit signs as well. So with that in mind, we put a bill out there that would change it so that we go back to an assumption that we're still teaching our kids, if they're in driver's ed, they come through driver's ed, and if you ask any one of them at 15 or 16 years old, how fast can you drive on a city residential street? They would tell you it's 25 miles an hour. And so this bill really goes back to that thing and says, yep, we're assuming that it's in a residential district inside of a city limit, it's a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit, and you don't have to post it. And for the city of Holland, it's a big number, $200,000. But for the city of Detroit, it's probably $1 million, or I don't really know what that number is, but way, way bigger. And so we're going to save money for every city and every part of the state just by doing this. And we've gotten the police forces, we had the state police involved, we had the sheriffs involved, we had the city police chiefs all involved in trying to help set that, as well as the Michigan Municipal League to do that. So we put everybody together in the room, said, okay, how can we fix this law? It was a good law, but we just needed to tweak it because of unintended consequences.
And one of the things, I mean, you used to see the signs, unless otherwise, you'd pull into town and say, unless otherwise posted as 25. So as you say, this has been a long-standing thing.
Exactly. So we're just trying to make it what people understood it to be.
The idea that it is so intricate when it comes to setting speed limits, it seems like kind of a no-brainer, but it isn't, as you point out, and those studies are not inexpensive. But there are other things that go along with this, and there's something about the 85th percentile that goes with these studies. And suggest that even after you do a study, and if you want to go to that 85th percentile, there are certain rounding methods that go with it. Right. You're looking into that.
Yeah, so I've got another bill that's out right now that's not been fully acted on, but is out there, and that would be that you're allowed to, setting speed, one of those ways to do that is 85th percentile. If you set that speed, let's just say it comes in at 41 miles an hour. Today, you'd have to move it to 45 miles an hour at the minimum. So you've just increased the speed limit 4 or 5 miles an hour over what it was the speed study would indicate. And that's, in most places where we're asking for a speed study to be done, most of the people in that neighborhood are saying, can we lower the speeds? Can we lower the speeds? So to go up off of that average, first of all, concerns people. And then the other piece of it is that it's, you can, besides that 85th percentile and being able to round down, which is an achievement because we've not been able to do that before, the other piece of it is that there's, when you're doing the speed study, if there are certain things along the road, maybe a school entrance, other kinds of church entrance, other kinds of things, you're able to back it down even further than that to like to the 50th percentile. So those cars that are traveling 50 miles, or I'm sorry, those cars that are traveling below that speed limit or below 50% of them, that would be the speed that you'd be able to set it at. So we're looking at trying to make that happen as well.
You are no stranger to watching how government works, and I think for somebody like you who has that background, this may seem like a normal process of government, but I think a lot of people watching this morning are going to be surprised that it is that detailed to get to speed limit studies. Is this the kind of stuff you thought you would be doing when you came to Lansing?
Yeah, well, because I've actually been involved from the county treasurer's role especially, I had spent time helping to try and craft some legislation that would change how people pay taxes or how people are enabled to do stuff. So for me, those are the things that I thought, I'm going to be involved in this. What I didn't understand is I was going to be on the appropriation side and do way more about budgets than I even do on the policy side, which is policy. That's what I'm working on with those particular bills.
Well, and the budget continues to be something that you will work on, and I'm sure you and I will have a chance in future shows to discuss that further. But let's talk a little bit about something that is a very current situation, not necessarily in your district, because as you pointed out when we were talking earlier, you don't have Lakeshore in your district, but you certainly do have a lot of people who have interest in Lakeshore in your district. You recently had a town hall and talked about the unusually high waters and some of the issues with that. You had Eagle come in, which is the old DEQ, and they were there. Talk about what you heard from some of those residents and about some of the outcomes.
Well, so first let me start with the department. Eagle did come in, and it was, so one of my friends who happens to have Lakeshore property sent me a text, said, hey, things are falling apart, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, I'm not really a Lakeshore person. That isn't, I don't have any of those residents. And I thought, so I mentioned it to one of my staff members, and they said, we should get the department together. Let's see if the department will come in and actually share with what's going on. One phone call, they called us back and said, we can do that. In less than a week, they were able to put together a town hall meeting for me. I was ecstatic about that Eagle would spend that kind of effort to make sure, and they had already been thinking about it logically, but that they were willing to come, stand in front of a group of probably angry folks and make some things happen. They've definitely moved forward in their efforts to be able to turn permits around, which is a great thing. The people of the community were, I think, pleased to be able to listen to Eagle, give their ideas about how they were going to change things, how they were expediting some stuff. There's some funny things that came out of the meeting. The people the department is saying, well, this is critical dunes, and so we're trying to protect it. And the people are going, you're not giving me a permit to protect my dune. How is it that you're protecting it? It was, if it's critical, how come I don't get critical? It was just, as people started to laugh about some of the just silliness about government that happens, and it happens at all levels. But but just really pleased that we move forward. Since then, I've actually heard from several folks who've said, you know what, it was 2 days, it's been 100 days that I had, at the meeting, they said it's been 100 days, we haven't gotten a permit. And in 2 days, they were able to get a permit. So things, I think, are moving. They've allocated some new folks to the lake shore. People heard positive things from the department. The department heard the concerns that they had, that the individuals had. I think lots of good information was shared, and I think we've put people on a road of understanding, maybe even a little better.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people have seen the stories. We've done a number of them, and you see the devastation that's taking place because of the erosion out there. What people may not understand is that when you own property along the lake shore, it is your property, but you have to get permission to make significant changes, and that's what we're talking about, this permitting, and that can be anything from building a seawall or making some kind of changes. So the department's got to sign off on it.
Right, exactly. And so what's interesting is we had asked, as part of that thing, is what can we do temporarily to help a property owner? Is there sandbags, rocks? What are the few temporary measures that they would allow to have happen? And I think they're working on that. We're still waiting to see the final results of that, which says, here are the things that we will permit, but we believe that they're on their way.
When you think about what it is that can be done, I mean, the force of nature is not something that you can easily contain. And while, again, I point out it's not in your district, you've certainly been out and seen, you have seen firsthand what some of this looks like. Did anybody have really substantive ideas about a short-term fix, or is this going to have to ultimately be a longer-term problem to deal with?
Well, there were both short-term fixes and long-term fixes. Let me just give you one that was of interest to me, not positively, but of interest. Somebody said we should take our cue from the Dutch. They've put up these seawalls, kept the whole country dry, drained the thing. We could make this happen. And I'm like, really, a dike along the whole Lake Michigan shoreline? I'm not sure that we're going to get people to buy into that. But in reality, there are a couple things. I think sandbags, it's a geotech bag that you can actually pump sand in out of the lake bottom into this bag. And so you're not adding new stuff, you're only adding a bag that could literally be slid open with a knife and pulled out of the sea, out of the water if we needed to. So I think there's some creative suggestions out there for people to, and things that could actually happen fairly quickly to help protect the shoreline. It's not going to stop it, but it would help to protect the shoreline.
When you think about, I mean, this kind of a circumstance, and again, in talking, I remember the first 15 years, 10 years that I was in West Michigan, we did story after story after story of low lake levels and what's going to happen, because there were these vast amounts of sand and mud that were between the beaches and the water level. And in that period of time, a couple of decades, it has changed to this, and it's likely to be something that continues to change regardless of whatever kind of solutions they come up with.
Right, and I think that if you look at the cycle map of what's happened over the last 100 years, because we have about 100 years of data, and you can see that we've been at this same height, water height, probably 4 times in that last 100 years. It's a 20 to 30 year cycle. We'll see it go back down in the next couple of years, but it will take a little bit to get there. In the meantime, we need to try and help people keep their houses, their dunes, all intact. And so I think Eagle is working on that and understanding that it's a critical need, and we need to add it as a critical importance. Emergency rules need to apply, and we need to move forward with that. And I think the department gets that now, and hopefully we'll continue to move forward with that.
The legislature returns to work this week for their final 9 days of scheduled session. What will be on the agenda? We'll talk about that next. To the point. So after nearly a year of Democrats and Republicans, the House, the Senate, and Governor all trying to grapple with divided government, the results are mixed, the path forward uncertain. There are 9 session days left in the year, and some are hopeful that an agreement can be reached to restore some of the spending cuts the governor made when she line item vetoed $1 billion from the budget the legislature sent her. It's not clear that there is enough cooperation to do anything with the budget in the short time left in 2019. And as the calendar rolls over to 2020, everything will be in the shadow of a big election that will have an impact here and nationally. And that could make an agreement that much more difficult. will be watching, and hope you will be too, every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock right here on Wood TV 8 for To The Point.